Section 28 of the Adventures of Odysseus. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Adventures of Odysseus and the Tale of Troy by Pádraic Colum. Part 2, Chapter 13. All night Odysseus lay awake, tossing this side and that, as he pondered on how he might slay the wooers and save his house from them. As soon as the dawn came, he went into the open air, and lifting up his hands prayed to Zeus, the greatest of the gods, that he might be shown some sign as to whether he would win victory or meet with defeat. And then, as he was going within the house, he heard the voice of a woman who ground barley meal between stones. She was one of 12, but the other women had fallen asleep by the quernstones. She was an ancient, wretched woman, covered all over with the dust of the grain, and as Odysseus came near her, she lifted up her hands and prayed in a weak voice. O Zeus, even for miserable me, fulfil a prayer. May this be the last day that the wooers make their feast in the house of Odysseus. They have loosened my knees with the cruel toil they have made me undergo, grinding for them the barley for the bread they eat. O Zeus, may they today sup their last. Thus the quern woman spoke, as Odysseus crossed his threshold. He was glad of her speech, for it seemed to him her words were an omen from Zeus, and that vengeance would be soon wrought upon the proud and hard-hearted men who wasted the goods of the house and oppressed the servants. And now the maids came into the hall from the women's apartment, and some cleaned the tables, and others took pitchers and went to the well for water. The men-servants came in and split the faggots for the fire. Other servants came into the courtyard, Eumaeus the swineherd, driving fatted swine, the best of his drove, and Philoetius the cattle-herd, bringing a calf. The goatherd Melanthius, him whom Odysseus and Eumaeus had met on the road the day before, also came, bringing the best goats of his flock to be killed for the wooers' feast. When the cattle-herd Philoetius saw a stranger in the guise of a beggar, he called out as he tethered the calf in the yard, "Hail, stranger friend! My eyes fill with tears as I look on thee, for even now, clad as thou art in rags, dost thou make me think of my master Odysseus, who may be a wanderer such as thou in friendless lands. Ah, that he might return and make a scattering of the wooers in this hall!" Eumaeus the swineherd came up to Philoetius and made the same prayer. These two and the ancient woman at the quern were the only ones of his servants whom he heard pray for his return. And now the wooers came into the hall. Philoetius the cattle-herd and Melanthius the evil goatherd went amongst them, handing them bread and meat and wine. Odysseus stood outside the hall until Telemachus went to him and brought him within. Now there was amongst the wooers a man named Ctesippus, and he was the rudest and the roughest of them all. When he saw Telemachus bringing Odysseus within, he shouted out, "Here is a guest of Telemachus to whom some gift is due from us. It will be unseemly if he should get nothing today. Therefore I will bestow this upon him as a token." Saying this, Ctesippus took up the foot of a slaughtered ox and flung it full at Odysseus. Odysseus drew back, and the ox's foot struck the wall. Then did Odysseus smile grimly upon the wooers. Said Telemachus, "Verily, Ctesippus, the cast turned out happily for thyself. For if thou shouldst have struck my guest, there would have been a funeral feast instead of a wedding banquet in thy father's house. Assuredly I should have driven my spear through thee." All the wooers were silent when Telemachus spoke these bold words, but they soon fell laughing at something one of their number said. The guest from Telemachus's ship, Theoclymenus, was there, and he started up and went to leave the hall. "Why dost thou go, my guest?" said Telemachus. "I see the walls and beams of the roof sprinkled with blood," said Theoclymenus, the second-sighted man. "I hear the voice of wailing. I see cheeks wet with tears. The men before me have shrouds upon them. The courtyard is filled with ghosts." So Theoclymenus spoke, and all the wooers laughed at the second-sighted man, for he stumbled about the hall as if it were in darkness. Then said one of the wooers, "Lead that man out of the house, for surely he cannot tell day from night." "I will go from the place," said Theoclymenus, I see death approaching. Not one of the company before me will be able to avoid it." So saying, the second-sighted man went out of the hall. The wooers looked at each other again, and laughed, and one of them said, "Telemachus has no luck in his guests. One is a dirty beggar who thinks of nothing but what he can put from his hand into his mouth, and the other wants to stand up here and play the seer." So the wooers spoke in mockery, but neither Telemachus nor Odysseus paid heed to their words, for their minds were bent upon the time when they should take vengeance upon them. Chapter 14. In the treasure chamber of the house Odysseus's great bow was kept. That bow had been given to him by a hero named Iphiclus long ago. Odysseus had not taken it with him when he went to the wars of Troy. To the treasure chamber Penelope went. She carried in her hand the great key that opened the doors, a key all of bronze with a handle of ivory. Now, as she thrust the key into the locks, the doors groaned as a bull groans. She went within, and saw the great bow upon its peg. She took it down and laid it upon her knees, and thought long upon the man who had bent it. Beside the bow was its quiver full of bronze-weighted arrows. The servant took the quiver, and Penelope took the bow, and they went from the treasure chamber and into the hall where the wooers were. When she came in she spoke to the company and said, "Lords of Ithaca and of the islands around, you have each come here desiring that I should wed him. Now the time has come for me to make a choice from amongst you. Here is how I shall make my choice. This is the bow of Odysseus, my lord who is no more. Whosoever amongst you can bend this bow and shoot an arrow from it through the holes in the backs of 12 axes which I shall have set up, him will I wed, and to his house I will go, forsaking the house of my wedlock, this house so filled with treasure and substance, this house which I shall remember in my dreams." As she spoke, Telemachus took the 12 axes and set them upright in an even line, so that one could shoot an arrow through the hole that was in the back of each axe-head. Then Eumaeus, the old swineherd, took the bow of Odysseus and laid it before the wooers. One of the wooers took up the bow and tried to bend it, but he could not bend it, and he laid it down at the doorway with the arrow beside it. The others took up the bow and warmed it at the fire, and rubbed it with lard to make it more pliable. As they were doing this, Eumaeus the swineherd and Philœtius the cattle-herd passed out of the hall. Odysseus followed them into the courtyard. He laid a hand on each and said, "Swineherd and cattle-herd, I have a word to say to you, but will you keep it to yourselves, the word I say? And first, what would you do to help Odysseus if he should return? Would you stand on his side, or on the side of the wooers? Answer me now from your hearts." Said Philœtius the cattle-herd, "May Zeus fulfil my wish and bring Odysseus back. Then thou shouldst know on whose side I would stand." And Eumaeus said, "If Odysseus should return, I would be on his side, and with all the strength that is in me." When they said this, Odysseus declared himself. Lifting up his hand to heaven, he said, "I am your master, Odysseus. After 20 years I have come back to my own country, and I find that of all my servants by you two alone is my homecoming desired. If you need see a token that I am indeed Odysseus, look down on my foot. See there the mark that the wild boar left on me in the days of my youth." Straightway he drew the rags from the scar, and the swineherd and the cattle-herd saw it and marked it well. Knowing that it was indeed Odysseus who stood before them, they cast their arms around him and kissed him on the head and shoulders. And Odysseus was moved by their tears, and he kissed their heads and their hands. As they went back to the hall, he told Eumaeus to bring the bow to him as he was bearing it through the hall. He told him, too, to order Eurycleia, the faithful nurse, to bar the doors of the women's apartment at the end of the hall, and to bid the women, even if they heard a groaning and a din, not to come into the hall. And he charged the cattle-herd Philœtius to bar the gates of the courtyard. As he went into the hall, one of the wooers, Eurymachus, was striving to bend the bow. As he struggled to do so, he groaned aloud. "Not because I may not marry Penelope do I groan, but because we youths of to-day are shown to be weaklings beside Odysseus, whose bow we can in no way bend." Then Antinous, the proudest of the wooers, made answer and said, "Why should we strive to bend the bow to-day? Nay, lay beside the bow, Eurymachus, and let the wine-bearers pour us out a cupful each. In the morning let us make sacrifice to the archer god, and pray that the bow be fitted to some of our hands." Then Odysseus came forward and said, "Sirs, you do well to lay the bow aside for today. But will you not put the bow into my hands, that I may try to bend it, and judge for myself whether I have any of the strength that once was mine?" All the wooers were angry that a seeming beggar should attempt to bend the bow that none of their company were able to bend. Antinous spoke to him sharply and said, "Thou wretched beggar, is it not enough that thou art let into this high hall to pick up scraps, but thou must listen to our speech and join in our conversation? If thou shouldst bend that bow, we will make short shrift of thee, I promise. We will put thee on a ship and send thee over to King Ectetus, who will cut thee to pieces and give thy flesh to his hounds." Old Eumæus had taken up the bow. As he went with it to Odysseus, some of them shouted to him, "Where art thou going with the bow, thou crazy fellow? Put it down." Eumæus was confused by their shouts, and he put down the bow. Then Telemachus spoke to him and said, "Eumæus, beware of being the man who served many masters." Eumæus, hearing these words, took it up again and brought it to Odysseus, and put the bow into his hands. As Odysseus stood in the doorway of the hall, the bow in his hands, and with the arrows scattered at his feet, Eumæus went to Eurycleia, and told her to bar the door of the women's apartment at the back. Then Philœtius, the cattle-herd, went out of the hall and barred the gates leading out of the courtyard. For long Odysseus stood with the bow in his hands, handling it as a minstrel handles a lyre when he stretches a cord or tightens a peg. Then he bent the great bow. He bent it without an effort, and at his touch the bowstring made a sound that was like the cry of a swallow. The wooers, seeing him bend that mighty bow, felt, every man of them, a sharp pain at the heart. They saw Odysseus take up an arrow and fit it to the string. He held the notch, he drew the string, and he shot the bronze-weighted arrow straight through the holes in the back of the axe-heads. Then, as Eumæus took up the axes and brought them outside, he said, "Thou seest, Lord Telemachus, that thy guest does not shame thee through foolish boasting. I have bent the bow of Odysseus, and I have shot the arrow aright. But now it is time to provide the feast for the lords who woo thy lady mother. While it is yet light, the feast must be served to them, and with the feast they must have music and the dance." Saying this he nodded to Telemachus, bending his terrible brows. Telemachus instantly girt his sword upon him and took his spear in his hand. Outside was heard the thunder of Zeus. And now Odysseus had stripped his rags from him and was standing upright, looking a master of men. The mighty bow was in his hands, and at his feet were scattered many bronze-weighted arrows. End of section 28.